Well, good evening to you all, and welcome. Thank you for joining the Iowa City Foreign Relations, ooh, that's loud, program featuring author William Lopez and Alejandra Escobar. My name is Peter Gerlach. I am ICFRC's Executive Director, and I am your host for tonight. Today is our second program in our Spring 2026 lineup. As a reminder, we plan for this program to go until about 7:30. We are deeply grateful for the long-standing support from our community, ensuring we can provide quality programming on international issues for over 42 years now. We wouldn't be here without you. Thank you. We hope everyone here will consider making a donation to our organization so we can continue this very important work. I want to tell you about our next program before we turn to the one that you're here for today. Please plan on joining us on Thursday, the 19th of February for Beyond Divides in Iowa City's Black Community, Building Bridges Between Us, with Abiti Willis, Mazahir Salih, Ashley Howard, Sunday Goshit, Vanessa Shannon, and Corte Beal. Hosted at Dream City, this community conversation will confront misconceptions and cultural divides, while also fostering solidarity and collaboration between Africans and African Americans in the Iowa City area. Together, we can move forward from separation to shared purpose through empathy, education, and collective empowerment. With that, let's turn to today's program. ICFRC would like to give a heartfelt thank you to our partners, the Iowa City Public Library and Prairie Lights. I also need to thank our sponsors and partners for our Spring 2026 series, Resisting Global Tyranny, of which this program is a part. This powerful and timely program series explores how people across borders resist authoritarianism, challenge structural injustice, and reimagine democracy. The Resisting Global Tyranny series brings together scholars, community leaders, students, and public intellectuals to confront the entangled systems of oppression, political, economic, and social that shape our world today. Humanities Iowa, Midwest One Bank, Prairie Lights, the Black Future Fest, the African Festival of Arts and Culture, the Immigrant Welcome Network of Johnson County, Dream City, Film Scene, the Englert Theater, and the Iowa City Public Library help make this important series possible. More information about the series is at the tables and around the room, as well as on our website. With that, it is truly my pleasure to introduce our speakers, and to do that, starting with Bill, I have a little bit of help today. Greta?
Hello, everyone. I'm Greta Rempel-Fisher, and tonight I have the honor of introducing my former professor and mentor. Dr. William Lopez is a clinical associate professor at the University of Michigan School of Public Health and faculty associate in the Latina Studies program. He is the author of Raiding the Heartland, An American Story of Deportation and Resistance, a follow-up to his award-winning first book, Separated, Family and Community in the Aftermath of an Immigration Raid. In addition to his academic research on the public health impacts of deportation, Dr. Lopez regularly contributes to the public discussions on deportation, diversity, and Latino culture in venues such as the Washington Post, CNN, San Antonio Express News, Detroit Free Press, and Truth Out. He is also on the boards of Health in Partnership and the Latino Newsletter.
Thank you, Greta. Alejandra Escobar is a passionate advocate for immigrant rights, most recently as the lead organizer at Escucha Mi Voz, Iowa, a nonprofit based in Iowa City that mobilizes communities to support and defend immigrants across the state. Born and raised in Colombia during a time of widespread cartel violence, Escobar witnessed firsthand the impacts of instability and loss. She moved to the United States in 2011 to pursue graduate studies in piano performance, eventually coming to Iowa to begin a doctoral program at the University of Iowa. Her journey from classical pianist to activist was shaped by life-changing experiences, including motherhood and the national reckoning on racial justice in 2020. Escobar chose to leave academia to fully commit to grassroots organizing. With Escucha Mi Voz, she led community protests, built deep relationships within within Iowa's Latin American immigrant community and advocated for systemic change with a focus on compassion, justice, and dignity. Folks, please help me in joining Alejandra and William.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you everyone for joining today. It's wonderful to see the room full to capacity and beyond. Thanks, Jason, especially for continuing to bring in more chairs. Like Peter, I'm also a professor, so I will use some professor tricks to get the audience involved. Please raise your hand if there's an empty seat next to you. Okay, a couple of empty seats left. Looks like we're still bringing folks in. Wonderful. And I'm wondering who's in the audience. Can we raise our hands if we live and work in Iowa City? All right. So I should have done the other way around. Who lives and works outside of Iowa City? Great. Where are you coming from?
West Grand.
Oh, great. Okay, and I saw another hand right behind. Where are you coming from? Wonderful. Muscatine. Anybody outside of Iowa?
Over there getting pizza.
From Canada. Great. Wonderful. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having us today. We were talking about how the RSVP number kept getting higher and higher, and it was at 100. And we were thinking that, prior to today, 100 RSVPs would have been about 40 people showing up. But right now, in this particular era, every immigration event we've gone to has been over the RSVP, filled to capacity, and that just brings joy to both of our hearts. So thank you for coming.
Yeah, I want to thank you too. There's not a better place right now for me to be. Like, I'd rather be here than any other place. I want to be with all of you. This is the only way we can connect and really make a change, by knowing each other, knowing our history, our stories, so we can move forward from this nightmare. Maybe to start, do you want to tell us what brought you to this deportation work?
Sure. So this is my second book, and my first book, Separated: Family and Community in the Aftermath of an Immigration Raid, is actually about a home raid that occurred 7 miles from where we work, from where Greta went to school at the University of Michigan. I wrote about this because it was important to me, because it was in my home community, and because, as I'll talk about more and more, lots of the world doesn't know what deportation looks like when it's in your neighborhood, when it's at your doorstep, when it's taking people you love away. And I'll just give a brief story about how I ended up writing that book, because it wasn't my plan. In this particular worksite raid, there were about a dozen men who were detained, about half a dozen of which who were taken. I was working on my dissertation at the time, and I planned to interview the folks who were taken away and then visit them as well. And as I was working to arrange the visit to Mexico with Santiago, and I'll use pseudonyms for all the names I say today, his sister told me, well, you probably don't want to go there right now. It's a little dangerous, right? He did leave there, after all, to come to the US. So I was planning to learn about what it was like to be the focal point of a raid, and a raid so, I will say, violent and traumatizing that SWAT and ICE were involved. And then I was told, no, don't go interview him, right? So I had to rethink what I was doing for my dissertation at the time. And I remember very clearly, I was driving down Michigan Avenue, and I went to Dunkin' Donuts and picked up a dozen donut holes and donuts, and I took them to his sister and his sister, excuse me. And she had 2 kids with her. And then I talked to her, right? I talked to her for a few hours, and I talked to her again. She put me on the phone with Santiago's sister in Mexico. And it occurred to me how much of the story of deportation we're often missing when we're thinking only of the person who's deported. It's not to say it isn't important to think about those who are removed, but for everyone removed, there's family connected. And ultimately, I think, as we'll talk about today, there's also community impacted. So that's what brought me through the first book, and then pivoting to the second one. I'll talk about that a bit more as I go on. The second book, I focused on 6 different sites of large-scale worksite raids. But between you and me, this book is mostly about Iowa. I don't know who's watching. Thank you all for watching and zooming in as well. But there's a lot of Iowa in this book. And why is that? Iowa has such a strong history of welcoming immigrants. And Iowa has many industries that are mostly worked by immigrants. And the largest worksite raid in history prior to the second Trump administration took place in Postville, Iowa. Like when I started writing about worksite raids, I started just to understand what a big part of Iowa's life and story this part of mass deportation was, that mass deportation was part of your story even before we started using this phrase, mass deportation. So maybe I can turn the question back to you. I am curious. So starting out with piano, what brought you to doing immigration work?
So I believe that music, literature, art, all of this can really make a change in communities. And if we start early, the outcome of the community, it's good. The community is gonna thrive if art is in there. So I am a pianist. And when Trump won the first election, I come from Colombia. I'm 40 years old. I grew up in the 80s, the 90s, the cartel, Pablo Escobar. I'm not related, although my last name. So I was surrounded by violence, you know, cars exploding, bombing buildings, shootings, killings. But the worst type of violence that I witnessed was displacement. When a family gets displaced or moved, pushed away from what they call home, it's extremely violent. And that marked me. Like, I saw that for many years. My grandmother and my grandfather were displaced. So Trump won the first election, and I still truly believe in piano. I was gonna make a change, right, by playing piano. Then Trump was elected again, and I was already a mother, and I thought, well, now I have to do something. And I'm a person that if I see that something is not working, I'm gonna take action. I'm gonna try to change it. And that's when I was like, okay, I need to do something, and I was also looking for a job, but I was like, I need a meaningful job that is connected to my roots, my community, and can make a change in the community. And that's how I became a community organizer. Yeah. So, yeah, thank you. Thank you. If you have read the book, great, because you're going to understand this. But if you haven't, I highly recommend it. So when I was reading your book, it's like I was reading what was happening in my life, working as a community organizer at Escucha Mi Voz. And you mentioned something really amazing. It's how different it is from Texas to the interior of the country, how deportation works, and how much quieter it is in the interior. And I don't know if you maybe would like to talk about it a little.
Sure. Yeah, so I was born in San Antonio, Texas. My mom was born in Mexico. My family has generally lived in Texas for all our lives. You know, we talk about in Texas, the border crossed us. And growing up in Texas, one thing I realized was that everybody was familiar with the border, right? You knew what it meant. And we knew what it meant to cross the border. We knew that it was dangerous, right? So one of the words that was used as a pejorative there was mojado, which means wet, which means wetback, swimming across the Rio Grande, right? So I grew up knowing this word. We grew up knowing that it was a racial term, a racial slur. And it was when I was writing that I started reflecting on the fact that we also knew that when you swam across the border, you could die, right? That was very much part of what we understood. Crossing the border, immigration meant possible death in a river, barbed wire, in a desert, right? And then, fast forward to when I was teaching at the University of Michigan, and I was teaching about immigration, and I realized I used the word mojado. Are you familiar with the song?
Not the song.
Yeah, there's a song that's by Arjona, which is an excellent song, but talks about border crossing illegally. And I played the song, and nobody knew what the word meant, right? And that shouldn't have really been a surprise, but it was really an enlightening moment because I realized that understanding immigration to me really meant that border, but there was a different understanding, if there was one at all, up in rural areas in the Midwest. And it really took talking to folks who were left behind after a deportation to help me understand what it meant. And I will read that piece because it was really a light bulb moment for me. If I had to describe it, I understood deportation along the southern border to be sweltering and sweaty, dusty and dirty, physically grueling and bodily violent. In the Midwest, it was quiet, then violating and climactic, traumatizing, then utterly, bitterly lonely and cold. And I think about how this characterized not only the home raids that I was studying, right, that I saw in Washtenaw County in Michigan, but even when we think back to as far back as Postville, Iowa raid, we know about it, right? But it was an extremely climactic moment. You all remember either from the stories, I'm sure from the newspapers, as I said, as a part of who you are as Iowans, the raid that later happened in 2018, about 10 years later in Mount Pleasant. It's this climactic moment where dozens, 32 in that case of Mount Pleasant, to hundreds in the case of Postville were taken. It spikes in the news, there's lots of attention, and then it kind of drones off, right? And we go about our daily lives with the people that we used to see, some of us as members of our families, but all of us as neighbors or community members, and they're suddenly gone. And this absence is felt so deeply, but it's an absence that's often hard to relay, and it's an absence that unfortunately is hard to relay in the media. So the story, I believe, the story of Midwestern, of rural deportations, is one that just doesn't get circulated. And it's part of why I wanted to write this book, because I felt that absence so deeply. Absence, loneliness, coldness, and fear that persisted far beyond those particular moments. You said, Alejandra, that rang true for you too, that deportations up here often feel lonely and cold. Say more about that.
They do, and they're quiet, and that's it's dangerous because it makes the community believe that it's not happening or it's not hurting. It makes elected officials not stand up for what's right because they believe that they're going to be putting a target in the community, which is not true because they're already here. You're just not saying it. But as a community organizer for the last year, I had been getting phone call after phone call after phone call. My cousin was detained, or my mom or my dad, and it's that absence because at Escucha, we did not only try to find the person who was detained, and many of them disappeared for weeks. Like, where are they? What jail are they? What state are they? And then go talk to those families left behind and taking care of those needs, right? So it's really hurtful, and it's really quiet, and it's terrible.
Yeah, and the way you say, that it's quiet and it's painful in that silence. One of my friends, a colleague, a professor in Michigan, when he lived actually in Minneapolis, and his apartment was raided by police one day. I forget why. I believe they raided the wrong place, and this was in about 2018, 2017, right at the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movements, the first time. And he talked about how he was abused by police, and this really kind of messed him up for a long time. His wife was a social worker. Together they started organizing. They started lots of anti-police violence work. And he said that really what healed him was his ability to feel like he was participating in some type of movement that would prevent future generations from having to experience what he went through. And part of what strikes me most about the silence around deportations, is often the movement is stifled because of this silence. So we're also missing this element of healing, this element of changing, being able to change a system that has harmed us. And what I've seen in organizing work, and both as a public health professional, you can often heal when you're not healing yourself, but when you take care of your children and the next generation, right? And when when our movements aren't big enough or loud enough or strong enough to take care of the next generation, that can often, it inhibits the healing of the trauma that immigrant communities go through as well.
Yeah. But the good thing that I'm seeing is now we're louder, right? Now we get our phones and we start recording and then we post it. And that's the way we can make this silence loud, right? We can stop them from thriving in the shadows by posting, by being present, by organizing, and going to trainings, how to record them and all of that.
Yeah, and by filling rooms to capacity like this, right?
Exactly. Connecting, organizing. Yeah. And, this takes us in a different direction a little bit, right? So we talk about deportations and what happens after deportations, and now we're also starting to see how do we respond, how do communities respond. I'm just wondering, we're seeing all these different ways of protest. Do you have a favorite one? Way of protesting?
Yeah. Any of the new protest techniques that have come up on the news? Is there one that sticks with you?
I love organizations that do trainings, like Escucha Mi Voz does that all the time, for not only for legal observers, but also for immigrants, because they have rights. We have rights. Less than the white community, but we do have rights, right? And so that's been my favorite thing, like seeing rooms packed because they want to know what to do if they find ICE on the streets. I think that's my favorite.
Yeah.
What about you?
Well, I think I've seen a couple that I really love. So I really love like creative forms of protest that come out. One is using 3D printers to print whistles. I think that's been, right, so there's been like lots of alerting folks to where ICE presence is. But protests actually tell us a lot about what's going on. Like the site of the protest can be really illustrative, a microcosm of the larger immigration movement. And I'll give you an example that's also one of my favorite forms of protest. But we see more and more musicians outside of hotels playing instruments, often brass instruments, to keep ICE from sleeping, keep ICE agents from sleeping. And I like this for a few reasons. One, again, is that it's creative, right? Two is that it's joyful, and you need this kind of joy to maintain a movement long term, and a movement that's very exhausting. But three is that these musicians often maintain the local flavor, right? So you have blues in some communities, you have mariachi music in other communities, right? Keeping these ICE agents awake. But going back to what I was saying, right, our protests often teach us something about the bigger movement. So it's not surprising to me that protests are going on in hotels or right outside of hotels, because deportation has always been about who gets to sleep soundly and where, right? And now the community is saying, it's been decades that you have not let us sleep soundly in our homes. If you are in our neighborhoods, we are not going to let you sleep soundly either. And in this case, they're doing it with music. And so, it also illustrates the power imbalance that can often happen between organizers and an industry like DHS that's funded with multiple billions of dollars, right? That ultimately DHS doesn't let immigrant communities sleep soundly by often going into their homes, and organizers in return at our full capacity, sometimes we're preventing them from sleeping, right? That's not to say this isn't a useful strategy. It's only to say that it's often one of many strategies that are needed when pushing against something funded in the billions of dollars of scale.
Agree. And you just mentioned something that's really interesting is exhaustion. We're exhausted, right? And it's impossible to maintain this energy, right? If we don't do the other side of it or another part of it. It's a big effort. It's rallying, it's going to ICE to accompany people, it's going to trainings, but also it's taking care of each other, it's loving each other, it's connecting with each other. So it has like both paces, fast and intense and sometimes violent, but also caring, loving, community oriented.
Yeah, and you know, speaking of exhaustion, this reminds me of lots of the folks that I've seen who are organizers, and I'll take us to Iowa. Excuse me, I'll take us to Ohio in this case. So there were 2 raids in Ohio in 2018, around the time that Mount Pleasant was raided as well, in Salem and Sandusky, right, our neighbors in Michigan. And these were pretty large-sized raids, and I talked to an organizer who was in between these 2 cities. So the way I describe it in the book is she and others responded to these raids, once in a lifetime sized raids, twice in her lifetime, in this case within a month. And she and others would tell me about how exhausting it was, right? And she was not the first person who described it this way, but she said, I would keep going, I would keep going, I would work 24/7 until one moment I would finally break down. And there was an advocate in O'Neill who put the best words to it, or put powerful words to it, I think. And she drove from the other side of Nebraska to O'Neill because the raid happened. Her father was a Guatemalan immigrant. She says, it reminded me of my family, and I knew I was going to do anything to be there. So she goes over there. She works multiple days straight. And she's telling me, I was so exhausted, but I didn't notice it. Until one day, I finally got a break. I went into the bathroom, and I found myself throwing up on the bathroom floor. Moving back to Salem and Sandusky, when I spoke with the woman there, she described this as most of us have secondary trauma from this experience, right? And what became clear to me in the work that I was doing, and what became clear to me perhaps more so after the killing of Renee Good and Alex Prairie, is that the administration wants the cost of loving and serving the immigrant community to be high. The DHS and the administration wants you to know that if you are going to serve your immigrant neighbors, you're going to find yourself throwing up in the bathroom. You're going to find yourself exhausted. And ultimately, you could find yourself killed, right? I wasn't attuned to this strategy earlier. When we talk about immigration enforcement in public health, we use this phrase, chilling effect. I see some head shaking. So I'm glad folks are kind of familiar with the idea. You're worried about deportation, so you're chilled out of engaging in any other social services, right? You're not getting food stamps, you're not getting supplemental security income, anything else, because you're not getting medical care because you're worried, right? When we talked about the chilling effect, it was generally saying that undocumented folks wouldn't get these services. Then we started to understand that, oh, this actually means their families don't get these services either, because often undocumented mothers and fathers won't take their children to get the resources they deserve as citizens because they're scared. But I think there's been a really drastic turn, and I think we're starting to see that, no, this chilling effect is actually extending out even further, right? And it's no longer just undocumented folks. It's no longer even immigrants or folks and their families. And it's no longer just Latinos or other immigrant communities. It's also the white community who supports immigrant communities. I think going back to your point, Alejandra, what you've said earlier is that it's about these moments, these high moments of perhaps violence and other moments of care. What this has really illustrated to me is that in caring for others now is just ultimately the time we can't do that without caring for each other at the same time.
Right. And you just mentioned something. It's deportation moves sideways, you know, like we were talking about the pulpo migra, which is octopus, and immigration or ICE is an octopus, right? And it moves in a way that it's sticky, it's hard to get out of it, it's disgusting, and it affects in so many ways, not only the person who's been detained and deported and the family, and then the neighbors, and then the workplace, and then the school where the children went or going, and it's just it's an octopus. And I told you we gotta chop it up and eat it in ceviche,
With
right?
lime, yeah. No, I love the pulpo migra imagery, right? So one of the things that I learned in writing about deportation is sometimes you needed different techniques as a writer to describe what was going on. Among the first is when you think about when you're reading a book, you're generally reading presents, you're reading characters who are present, right? But in mixed status families and communities, I had to describe it, I had to learn to write about absence. I had to learn how to talk about two people there and one person who wasn't, and relationships in which one was physically there and one was perhaps in transit and perhaps disappeared, right? It's not a writing technique I was used to. How do you describe absence so that it's palpable? And then, you know, the pulpo migra I love so much because it really does feel like tentacles infiltrating and slowly, you know, wrapping up the community and drawing it. I don't want to say drawing it together, quite the opposite, right? Drawing it apart. And I want to give an example too. You mentioned schools, Alejandra, of how the pulpo migra can impact school, right? The fear of deportation can impact schooling. In Bean Station, Tennessee, also raided in 2018, a meatpacking plant, so you all know very well this type of work, 98 people taken, which was a very, very large raid. And again, we've seen higher in Allen, Texas was larger in 2019, and in Georgia, Elabel, Georgia, just recently was the biggest in history. In Bean Station, so Bean Station is this very, very tiny town. Most of the immigrant community lives in Morristown, Tennessee, very, very close. Morristown, Tennessee is where all the children go to school of those families. General day in Morristown sees 75 absences. The day after the raid, there were 560 absences, right? So over 5 times as many students absent. Why? A few obvious reasons. Some may have lost a driver. Some may have lost the other spouse and the partner, the wife, often, because as many men who were working was not going to drive when they had other things to worry about. And some folks may not have had any relation to the meatpacking plant, but were still worried to drive. Now, who do we think is going to address the absences of these children? You all can answer. Who's going to address all these absences? Donald Trump's not quite the answer I was looking for. Who in Morristown is going to address all these absences? Yeah, the teachers, the schools, the educators. This is a truth that I've come to understand, that every single time for worksite raids, they happen between 8 and 5. By definition, they're during the workday. Where are kids between 8 and 5? Every single time these adults are taken, it's educators, it's teachers who are going to have to explain to those children that the parents who dropped them off might not be the parents who picked them up. Speaking of how...
And they would have to explain to those students that are going to school, but the others didn't come, like, why is my Latino community,
Yes.
right, not at school? What happened, you know? And we're talking about 5 years old or 8 years. How are we gonna? How do they address that?
Exactly.
You know?
So the
Right?
teachers have to explain the racial dynamics to the students.
Exactly.
And then they have to make up for the racial gaps in grades that occur.
Exactly.
So what research shows is that after these raids, absentee goes up, but among whom? Latino students. Math scores go down and language scores go down. Among whom? Latino students, right? So not only are teachers explaining this to their students, but now they're addressing this huge achievement gap, right? So going back to what we were talking about, right? The tentacles of La Migra, the tentacles of ICE that bring in and you know, stick, or else sticky, like your words were accurate, right? Just
Gross.
yeah, gross.
Yeah.
They're ensnaring teachers into this as one of the primary white folks who are impacted by mass deportation.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess, you know, when I think about and when I tell the story of deportation, right, lots of what we do in public health is bringing up truths about health that once you hear them, you feel like you've always known them, right? They're kind of intuitive, like, oh, okay, this is the healthy choice. I get this now. when I talk about deportation, I'm always bringing up that aside that after immigrant families, the primary group of people who are going to experience the impacts of mass deportation are our nation's educators. And universally, folks understand that, right? Because every time an adult is deported, if those adults have children, those children are probably in school when it happens.
It's also, I don't know, you correct me, but you cannot thrive if you're not around your loved ones, right? So that becomes a public health issue as well. All
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. So you notice I'm a public health professor and I've given like no words that you would typically be associated with health, but I'll do so briefly. I did say chilling effect, so that is public health. Okay. If I were to talk like a public health professor, I could say things like, right, after deportation, we see anxiety increase, we see depression increase, we see things like PTSD symptoms increase among families, among especially parents, especially among parents left behind. If I were to tell you what are the most impactful types of arrest, and again, I want to talk about impact as worse and worse, not here's how you do it well and here's how you do it poorly, right? So I'm talking about increments of harm. And the worst deportations, rather the worst impacts on children, the research shows, are when they're in close proximity to an arrest. So you can think of someone witnessing an arrest in a home versus someone witnessing across the street versus someone who heard about it. Again, I'm not saying any of these are ideal. I'm just contrasting them. And the chronicity of it, meaning how many times has it happened, right? And when you think about some of the folks that you know, and when we think about some of the tactics that we're seeing in Minneapolis right now, we are seeing high chronicity, meaning we're seeing multiple deportations. Children are witnessing multiple deportations in a very short amount of time. And they're seeing it with very close proximity, meaning we remember the case of the grandfather who was brought out in his Crocs and bathrobe, right, with children. So children are witnessing it right next door, or rather closer than next door often, right? So very close proximity is what I want to say. So when we think about how the health impacts are going to, or rather how the health of these children will be impacted, we're seeing some of the worst cases play out right now in Minneapolis with frequent and with violent arrests.
That's right. My own experiences, my own kid asking about it constantly. What's going to happen? She knows I'm an immigrant. She, my English and whatever. It's what's going to happen to you. What's going to happen if you get taken? What's going to happen if you get killed? And she has not witnessed thankfully, any arrest or anything, but it's in the community, it's in the air, and it's affecting everyone.
Mm-hmm. And I like that you describe it as in the air. So I often talk with lots of folks who are law students or lawyers or policy folks, right? And very concerned appropriately about the law and about the policy. But, children often don't know the specifics of law and policy. And dare I say, adults, even adults who study this all the time, still usually don't know the specifics of the law and the policy, right? Why? Many reasons. It's complicated and they're frequently changing. So when it comes to immigration enforcement and fear of deportation, most decisions are not made on the concrete law and the policy. They're made first on what people believe the law and the policy to be, but more often they're just made based on the rhetoric that is heard around those laws and policies, right? So if we see a president who is saying these people are animals, right, a quote, we know that folks are not thinking about what's the specific of the policy. They're thinking about what is this immigration enforcement, what is ICE and what is La Migra going to do to people when they're working for someone who thinks they're animals. And this is even, to your point, I think, Alejandra, for children, this might be even worse. Children are certainly thinking, sensing what their parents are talking about and just absorbing what news is on in the background.
Yeah. And talking about policy, the immigration policies in the United States are based on the Chinese. We were talking about this, Chinese Exclusion Act from the 1800s, which is racist to the core. And then these policies are in that context. And so immigrants don't, it's made for immigrants to have few rights. And we need to change that. And that's exactly the immigration reform. It cannot be based on something that is so racist, like the Chinese Act, right?
Yeah, and it is, it's something that folks doing immigration work have known throughout the history of this work, right? That immigration law rather has always had these racial undertones. That it's always been about purifying our country racially, right? We see this in the Chinese Exclusion Act. We certainly saw it after 9/11. But it's even more overt now. So we see that in Minneapolis, actually I think this was in California, right? There was the case where Border Patrol said we would like to use, that it should be legal to use skin color and accent as part of creating a case for reasonable suspicion against people, right? And this was never previously the case. When you're thinking about probable cause and reasonable suspicion, accent and skin color were not allowed to be part of that calculation. The officer had to articulate different and multiple reasons for the reasonable suspicion, and your demographics could not be part of that. But we see a change in that, right?
We do.
And now is probably the time that's been the most overt racist enacting of immigration law.
Yeah. In your book, you mentioned racial profiling in the South, right? And so those techniques that were used in the South have been brought to the interior, and now we see it all the time.
Yeah, and speaking of the South to the interior, right? I think one of the biggest changes we've also seen, especially in Minneapolis, is the use of Border Patrol away from the southern border. Now, why is this important, right? It's important for a few reasons. ICE and Border Patrol really have different types they function very differently. Border Patrol is often patrolling these vast open spaces with very little accountability in between their stops, right? They're operating alone on the border, and fairly less frequent stops certainly than what they're seeing in Minneapolis. But when you bring Border Patrol up to Minneapolis, we see the level of violence that comes both from lack of transparency, lack of accountability, and also certainly lack of training, a hiring process that's sped up, right? The other change we see, right, so ICE does operate in the interior, but traditionally ICE would operate with, again, I don't want to say this is doing it well, I just want to point out the way that they've previously operated. These large-scale worksite raids or home raids were often targeting a group of people or an individual. Certainly other people would get picked up. This was called collateral. I've written about it, right? This is often part of the racial profiling as well. But ICE is not targeting single individuals. What they're doing is staying and occupying the city much more. And when this happens, right, this is just a recipe for violence. One of the things, many things have caught me off guard during this second administration, things that I would not have predicted despite having written about this for a decade or so. One is that most worksite raids tend to take place in the summer. Now, as Iowans, just like as Michiganders, certainly as Minnesotans, we have a lot of reasons why we wouldn't do outdoor operations in the winter, right? They're happening in the summer because agents are standing outside. They have to organize their vehicles. They have helicopters. They're fully armed. You do these kind of operations in winter, and you have exactly what we're seeing. You have agents slipping all over the place. You have people dropping their weapons. There was a magazine, an ammo magazine found outside of a school, right? These operations are happening in the winter, as I argue, specifically because of the chaos they're causing, and specifically because it's amping up the opportunity for violence. And when there's more violence that can be blamed on protesters, there's more enforcement, there's more agents that can be brought into the city.
I'm wondering, Bill, if after all this information, people have some questions.
Yeah, it sounds like a good time. Peter, do you have a microphone to help us?
I do, yes. Is that working? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. So I do have a microphone. I will come around to you if you have a question. I'll do my best to work through the back. Where would you like to start? Who has a question for these wonderful speakers?
Thank you for speaking with us. All of this and throughout the years, this has always reminded me of Japanese internment on U.S. soil. And the big reason for that was like a big land grab, taking people's homes, farms, along with demoralizing. And I wonder what you kind of conceptualize as the reason for this big of a push right now.
This big of a push.
In especially Latino immigrants. I mean,
Yeah.
it's all of us, but it is
Mhm.
especially. I wonder, is the point to demoralize, to have us all afraid, to like what?
Yeah.
Besides cruelty, besides the obvious, like
What is the point?
what is
Yeah.
the
What-
goal that you see?
Yeah, so first, I think I'm glad you brought up and compared to Japanese internment, right? And so part of what the U.S. did in that situation is turn a particular set of people, in this case, Japanese Americans, into the villains, saying they're a threat on U.S. soil to Americans, in air quotes, right? Separating the two groups, and then, as you mentioned, taking their land, right? Taking property and interning them. I want to go back to 9/11 just to bring something up, right? That's when we saw a change from the INS, Immigration Naturalization Services, to the Department of Homeland Security. Department of Homeland Security, you need a few things. Homeland, you need a foreigner. Security, you need danger, right? So that shows a very big shift in our mindset from services and naturalization. Certainly there were deportations under INS too, but services and naturalization to militarization, danger and removal. And I think most importantly, we see this switch to keeping our nation safe from terrorists, right? This is why this domestic terrorist label that we see used against Rene Good can be so powerful, because it allows us to cordon off a particular community, as we did to Japanese Americans, say they're a danger to those other Americans, and then often take the resources that they have. So a good question. I'm glad you brought Japanese internment up. You also asked, so what's the point of all this? And yes, I think largely spectacle is the point, right? Largely the visibility of it is the point. Adam Serwer wrote, "The cruelty is the point," and that stuck with it. What I've come to understand after my work in the heartland of the US is that the chaos is also the point. Because chaos causes more violence, which causes more spectacle, right? And the administration is able to foreground the enforcement that they're doing. What would you add, Alejandra?
I would add they need a scapegoat,
Yeah.
right? So before it was the Irish, they were dirty, they had diseases, then it was Chinese, then now it's Latinos. They always need someone to blame for whatever is going on, right? And right now it's immigrants, especially Latinos, are taking away what you want for your life. They're taking away your jobs, they're taking away your health care, although everything's a lie, right? They're taking away your vouchers for paying home. They're taking away everything that you wanted for your life. You don't have it, not because we're terrible as a government, but it's because of immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think that's part of it. And cruelty, definitely cruelty.
Yeah. Slightly related, perhaps. You mentioned taking away your health care, right? Which we generally know not to be the case. So the Affordable Care Act was going to be funded, and ultimately many subsidies weren't funded. 30 billion of your subsidies were not reinstituted. Anybody know how much money went to ICE in the big beautiful bill? I'll give you a hint, it's the same number. Yeah, $30 billion, right? So 30 billion from your subsidies went out of your health care and to fund ICE.
We know during the Obama administration there were millions of deportations, but was it done more humanely, or is there a more humane way to do it?
Yeah, a question
how
I
it was
really
done there.
appreciate, right? A question I appreciate too. So, deportations have happened under every administration in history, Republican and Democrat alike. We often get this zinger of like, you wouldn't be saying that during the Obama administration, but most of us have been doing this during Obama, during Biden, during Trump 1, during Trump 2, some of us during Bush. But the question, right, was it done differently? Was it more or less people? Is a worthwhile question. And I think there's a couple of things to think about. So yes, Obama was described as the deporter in chief for the volume of deportations, right? About 500,000, I believe I think there was 450,000 over one of those years, right? Which led to the numbers you're citing. Obama prioritized recent arrivals and folks with felonies, right? So that means he focused the enforcement energy on these two groups of people. Again, not saying a better or worse way to do it, but I want you to understand, how it's different. Obama also said we're focusing on felons, not families, right? This is an important, or felons, not fathers, excuse me. Important that he was focusing on particular people, and I want to contrast to Trump later, but also this is a really dangerous dichotomy to wake, right? It goes back to the good immigrant versus bad immigrant, the felon versus the father. As we all know, these groups are one and the same. They all overlap, right? So we see that he enforced particular individuals, which meant that other individuals that we're now seeing swept up were not swept up, right? So we didn't see, for example, as many 5-year-olds like Liam Conejo Ramos, right? We didn't see as many mothers. We didn't see as many caretakers swept up. This is the difference with the Trump administration. My guess is that the sheer number of deportations is less, but that there is no enforcement priorities, so there's many more people in many more situations getting swept up, right? One of the hypocritical things I also like to point out is that the Trump administration's reason for doing this, stated reason for doing this, is to get rid of the worst of the worst. And he is saying he's getting rid of the worst by actually removing all prioritizations of folks at all, right? So this is the least efficient way to focus on a particular group. Again, I do not want to be seen as arguing that we should do this like Obama and not Trump, because I have documented that I did not say that during the Obama era, and I'm not saying that during the Trump era, but the differences are nonetheless worth considering and worth thinking about. They can also inform our advocacy, right? So when we know that, for example, more fathers, unfortunately, were getting picked up than the general public, it informed a certain type of advocacy. When we see that children are getting picked up, when we see that mothers and caretakers are getting picked up, it means our organizing also has to be different.
I want to add that we're not only seeing mass deportation, we're also seeing mass legalization. So people are losing their legal documentation, right? So that's something that we have to be mindful of, right?
Exactly. I want to go back to I'm sorry, I meant to make one more point. Is there a humane way to do deportation? It's like saying, is there a healthy way to smoke a cigarette, right? So deportation at its very core is always going to be harmful, right? It's always going to, all the literature shows, it's what all the public health research shows. Smoking a cigarette is always going to be harmful, right? Incarceration is always going to be harmful. These are objective health facts. Now, I always suggest to people, no matter how you feel about these things, no matter who you vote for, no matter if you smoke or not, you still want to know if it's harmful or not, right? The debate is not whether or not it's harmful. It is. What you do with that knowledge, right? How it shapes your vote is really what I want folks to think about. But as for the question, is there a healthy or humane way to do deportation? No, the answer is an objective no.
Thank you. One thing I would like to comment, octopus is a wonderful animal. Maybe we need another symbol. They're so intelligent. And
do you have
beautiful,
one?
Right? But something like, it's interesting that someone brought this situation that was similar in terms of like, yes, there's mass deportation before. So today, what I think, and I want to hear your opinion, it seems to me that in a way the violence involved and the way like focusing on places like Minneapolis or Portland, where in a way is a provocation to bring reaction, violent reaction, right? So this is why Minneapolis is such a wonderful example, the way how they are standing up in like a peaceful way with music and everything. Don't you think that also this violence is a way of like, how can I say that, like showing to people that support this administration, look what we're doing, you know, like, because it's so simple, it's so easy to make the immigrant experience like just one thing, right? And the immigrant experience is variety. There's a, you know, I'm an immigrant. There's so many other people that came from different countries, and this way they simplify. They just say, you know, I'm an alien, right? I have an alien number, and it's a way of reinforcing how alien we are, right? It's a way of showing for people who support this administration, this is what you wanted, and this is what we're giving to you. It's like kind of like a way of legitimating something that we could never think that would be acceptable, right? And in the beginning, I remember when I was afraid of what, because I have seen this happening in other places, people would tell me, oh, we have a constitution, don't worry about that, you know? And looking at me like, well, you're a foreigner, you don't understand. And just like going back quickly to what you said in the beginning about like the fatigue, today I learned a word that students, Black leadership students use, that's like RS, racial battle fatigue. So that's something important that we remember, that when we, and this has connections with also students here, like Latin American students, that they say, older organizers are saying, we were in the streets fighting, and what are you doing? And these people, we are afraid. So we have to remember also that those populations, not only immigrants, but Black immigrants, Black communities, they have been suffering that for very long. So I'm not saying that we needed that, but I would like to know if you feel that we could use this as an opportunity to see that, no, that wasn't beautiful before. Not everything was perfect before. It just became more evident. And like the violence made us to believe that, yes, maybe we're not paying attention, we should pay more attention to that. Thank you.
Yeah, you want to go? Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to say that it's a game of power, right? So this administration, it's showing we have the power, we have the guns. I'm gonna make this work for ICE. We're not gonna prosecute them, or we have whistles, they have guns. So it's a game of power, and that's exactly authoritarianism, right? It's I'm up here, or autocracy as well, right? I'm here and I'm the leader and I have the power. I have control, and I'm gonna show you. And it's this patriarchy image that I have in my brain, that it's, we need a father figure that's gonna lead us somewhere. And he wants to be that. We need daddy, a white dad who's gonna take us somewhere. And this is exactly the power, I think, dynamic.
Yeah, I love that you brought up as essentially, maybe I'm paraphrasing, has this always existed and is now coming to the surface, right? Yeah, two things come to mind immediately. One is Minneapolis was stormed by ICE because of Somali immigrants, right, Black immigrants, that resulted in the arresting of Latinos, largely, that resulted in the killing of a white woman and later a white man. And Renee Good was killed a mile from where George Floyd was killed, right? So this is different types of state violence, whether it's the police, you know, those in blue, whether it's those in green, La Migra, still resulting in the death of multiple communities. So I would say, yes, this is something that is now being brought to the surface. I think of the phrase mass deportation a lot, right? So we see that now in 2026. We kind of saw it emerge back into the public consciousness when Trump was running for re-election in the when he won. There were signs people were holding up that said mass deportation now, right? But, you know, I would say that Iowans knew what mass deportation was far before the rest of the country saw this kind of occupation. When I saw in Mount Pleasant and what you saw in Postville, right? These worksite raids were mass deportation, perhaps not on this massive of a scale, but you were losing significant portions of your population all in one day. So I would say yes, these are often things that have already existed that are now being brought to the surface. Sometimes we haven't seen it at this scale and we haven't seen it this overt, because I do think the power is meant to show. The power is, as I mentioned, the spectacle, right? The violence is meant to show that power. So perhaps it hasn't been this overt, but yes, we're seeing things that have long existed.
Alejandra, Dr. Lopez, thank you so much for your comments so far. I wanted to ask two related questions. One, what can we learn from our neighbors to the north in Minneapolis in the rich approach to organizing that they've conducted? Is there anything that we can be learning from that experience? And secondly, what do you need from us here in our community? It's been amazing to learn from this conversation. What else can we learn? What action do we all need to be taking together?
So from Minneapolis, I think we have to learn that together, we have power, right? And I've said this before, but what is power, right? And we're afraid of it because of the abuse of power from those who are in power. So power is our capacity to act together in order to make a change, right? So that's what we're seeing in Minneapolis. They're acting together, the community is together, and they're trying to make a change, and it's working, right? It could have been worse in terms of mass deportation. Renegade and Alex Prairie would have not died. So, right, it's a balance. From our community here in Iowa City, we need to connect. We need to organize. We're going to be voting for county supervisor. We're going to be voting for Congress. So we need to organize and really think of what's going on in the country and what can we do to change this. And the way we can change is voting right? And voting, first of all, because people don't vote, voting right for those who have been standing up for what's right, and connecting. In each neighborhood, you should have a rapid response team. What is a rapid response team? Like, my neighbor, this is his name, this is his family, this is his address, was taken, right? There's a baby left behind, we need diapers. And all of this, again, there is this intensity to deportation, but there's also like caring and loving, and we need that. We need that in the community, and that comes from connection, from knowing one another.
Yeah. Where did the question come from?
In the back.
Great. Wonderful question. I have about 5 answers to that question, but I'm just going to keep myself to 2. This one story reminds me of somebody I met in Mount Pleasant who I hope is watching. But she ran a book group out of her church, right? And the Mount Pleasant, the raid happened, and folks were slowly thinking, well, what can we do? We need space to organize. And she said, well, we had already had a meeting on the books. Sure, it was a book group, but come to the book group and we'll get going, right? And slowly word spread, and others from families who have lost a family member were also like, well, we also need space. Like, well, I have something on the calendar. It was a book group, but come on in and let's see what we can figure out, right? And part of what I learned there and what I see over and over is that the best organizing usually builds on infrastructure that existed for some other reason, right? And it builds on connections that already existed. So what I like to tell folks is that you may have infrastructure for something entirely different than the immigrant rights movement, and that's exactly the kind of infrastructure that you should be able to switch if you want to make a difference in this particular community, right? So one takeaway I think that I've seen is that flexibility, right? Don't think you have to start today. Think about what you already have built and who you already know, and see if you can pivot. See if you can use that book club and make it into a Know Your Rights training, right? The second that we've seen in Minneapolis, I think we're starting to see two different kinds of strategies. One is prevention of deportations by alerting everyone to where ICE is. This often involves whistles and rapid response. Incredibly important, and we've learned lots of better strategies on how to do this. In order for these to work, you often need lots of folks who can respond quickly, and it often takes a minimum number of deportations so that folks or arrests so that folks can respond, right? Sometimes in our community and perhaps in your community, it happens a little rarer. The arrests are a little more rare, and they're a little more spread out. So it's not happening on a few city blocks. It's happening with miles and miles of fields in between, right? So it's a little harder for us to react. And that's okay. It just means there's some other strategies we have to engage in as well. And I think, as Alejandra mentioned, there's also all of these strategies of caretaking that always need to be done once someone is removed, but actually need to be continued whether or not people are removed, right? So to go back to your example, if I were to bring an object that characterized what I saw throughout these raids, I would actually bring a pack of diapers. Yeah. Everywhere I went, there were cars full of diapers. There were donation stations full of diapers because it was one of the first things people needed. And you know that if people stop buying diapers, you know they have no expendable income whatsoever, right? And I'm bringing this up to say that the need is there. And if you can't work on preventing deportation, you can continually work on building these networks of care for things like diapers and food or dropping children off at school. So that was only two, but that was a great question. Yeah, thank you.
So many of these people that are taken, I know, and just even our own town, there's a lot of immigrants, that restaurants and things that are being taken. Do you see any movement from businesses to say, hey, you just took my people? Do you see any of that? And I look at the economic impact of taking these people out of communities and what it does to communities. At what point does that problem reach Washington, D.C.?
You mentioned that in your book, and I can't remember what factory it was, meat packing or something, where the workers, there was a raid, they were taken, and then guess what? They had to close the factory, right? Mm-hmm. And are we seeing that right now?
Yeah, and you often do, right? So I think there's a number of economic impacts. One is certainly that those workers specifically are taken. What we see happen a little bit more, though, is that this chilling effect extends to all of that place's customers, right? So Latino grocery stores, the Mexican restaurant, they're not going to have anybody go to them. And those restaurants exist in a bigger economy, right? Your Iowa City economy hosts many of these. So when folks aren't leaving their homes, you're losing all these customers, you're losing all these paying clients. So the entire economy ends up taking a hit. The other thing I like to remind folks of is that immigrants are often thought of as producers, right? Working in agricultural industries, working in meatpacking plants, etc. But immigrant communities are, of course, also consumers, contributing millions of dollars to the economy, right? In many ways, not the least of which are house tax, automobile tax, fuel tax, sales tax, right? So removing folks is not only removing often, we realize, a means of production, but also removing all of this expendable income from your communities. This is, of course, not it is certainly one of the ones we think about because it's one of the ones that ties us together across our economy, right, in a particular organization. When will it reach Washington? That's a different question, I think. I do see more farmers who rely on farm labor, many of whom are Republican, often opposing the mass deportation because it's taking many of the folks who work in their industries. But I do think this becomes a class issue, right? At what point where the lack of Medicaid subsidies impact the upper class politicians? It may not. So it's something they can sacrifice. At what point will small towns who are losing their immigrant producers and consumers impact people in Washington? It may not, right? So they may be willing to sacrifice our communities. And that's one of the things that should also draw us together across these lines of class and across these lines of race, is that it's not race and it's not political party that's insulating us anymore, right? There are expendable portions of the white community and of the Republican community. And I do think soon people will wake up to that. Take a question on the other side of the room just so we can get a breath, right? I'm just kidding, go ahead.
Hello, thank you, Dr. Lopez and Alejandra, for this conversation. Kind of piggybacking on that question, I'm interested to hear about what you think about this shift in the perception of immigrant workforce here in the U.S. in comparison to, I don't know, the Bracero program from the 40s and 60s, where, you know, Mexican Braceros were recruited by the U.S. to, you know, do this labor and were kind of appreciated for it. So hoping you can talk about, you know, this just drastic shift to now.
Yeah, so the Bracero program, for those of you who may not be aware, the Bracero meaning arms, workers who work with their arms. We brought in many workers from Mexico because many US-born men were off in World War II, right, fighting. So many Mexican men worked in our factories. And I would say, yes, to your point, they were argued as a valuable workforce in the US. Actually, the first mass deportation campaign came when we were done with our Braceros, though. Yeah, so unfortunately named Operation Wetback was when we said, oh, our soldiers are coming back. You're no longer valued. We're going to deport you. We deported them in trains and on boats and in horrible conditions, right? So I think, you know, your point is a great one when you take the beginning and how the Bracero program ended, is that we do talk about immigrants, to use your phrase, as scapegoats, right? We do start with them as valuable, and then when we need them as scapegoats, we will switch to that. They tend to be this Rorschach test of what's needed politically. And, you know, as I argued in my book, what Trump needed at the first administration was to show that he was a hawk, was to show that he was able to do, to conduct an army, you know, engage in this militarized enforcement. And immigrant communities were a convenient place to be able to do that, right? So that's the way he used it. But I think, yeah, the history of the Bracero program showing we valued our workers, that was the story. And then when we no longer did, we removed them, I think is happening again, even using the same language of mass deportation from the 50s to now. You want to respond, Alejandra? No?
Hi, thank you for this. I'm a journalist. I covered the Postville raid for the Des Moines Register. I was there that day and the aftermath. And I realized that day that they wanted us to be there. ICE made sure we were there.
The reporters.
And because they wanted to make a spectacle and they wanted to scare people. And so it's such an important story to cover, but how can the media do a better job of covering it without falling into that?
Can I ask your name?
Tony Lace.
Thank you. Thank you for covering the story. I'm sure I've read lots of your work. Appreciate it.
Go ahead.
Sure. How can the media do a better job of covering this? What a great question. One of the things that I have heard from reporters is they're often used to taking what a government agency says and reporting it to people as fairly trustworthy and accurate. And there was this moment where DHS clearly switched to their reports of immigration raids being, I would say, containing a large amount of propaganda, right? We are arresting, and they would use words like child molesters and list the hundreds of people, and they would list one or two people. It was clearly making a particular argument. And journalists kept citing, you would often see 75% of the piece was citing ICE. And journalists have begun to pick up on the fact that perhaps that's not an accurate way of reporting on a raid anymore. So I think that would be the first piece of advice I would give, is to look critically at the information. I would personally say not to cite the DHS, but at a minimum to look critically at the information the DHS is giving. The second, and sometimes this is out of reporters' hands, but what happens on the day of the raid versus a week later versus a month later can be very different. And it's to go back to where we started, right? It's that the day might be loud, but the month that follows feels so quiet and lonely. And often that's what's needed, is more conversation about what happens later. The third thing that I would say is focusing on the workers is important and critical, and focusing on their spouses and children is also really important, and extending out just a little bit further to others in the community, whether it's customers or employers or friends or neighbors, can really illustrate the ways that we're all linked together too.
Hello. I just wanted to thank you guys both for being here and doing this. I wanted to touch on, you said we need to organize to vote. And so my question is what we should be asking politicians when they have open forums, because so many of the politicians on the left right now, the rhetoric with ICE is that they want, they're highlighting how untrained they are, right? You see all these videos of people talking about how they have less training hours than a hairstylist does, which is insulting, A, to hairstylists who have a lot of training, and B, I'm just, to my black ears, that sounds like those politicians want to train them even better than they're trained now, so they can continue doing the work that they're doing and putting people of color and immigrants at risk. I dream of an America where ICE is not only not trained well, that they're not having to be trained at all, that they don't exist. And it seems like there's no politicians in the United States that are daring to have that dream. And it's just disheartening as a 26-year-old black woman living in the Midwest that there's no politicians that are speaking to that point. And instead they wanna, I guess just make sure that when ICE does murders, they're doing them for the right reasons. And I don't support that, but what should we be asking when the Iowa politicians brave enough to let us ask some questions, let us ask questions, because we also have an issue here where many of them won't open the floor to questions at all. Mm-hmm. So how do we use our time wisely when we're interrogating them before the next election?
That's amazing. That's a great question. So let's start local, right? So we can then expand. So right now, city council or county supervisors? County supervisors, let's go there. There's always an agenda of what's gonna be happening, and there's always public comment. So I encourage each of you to read the agenda and to go take time. It's a couple of hours of your Wednesday, usually, in the morning, and go speak up, because they need to hear from the community how important these issues are and what they should be doing, right? And because we're really a really red state, it's hard for a couple of them to fight all of this, but they're willing to pass resolutions or at least discuss those resolutions. And so for the community needs to put pressure on those who are against those resolutions and show why is this important for the community. It's not a law, it's not gonna change everything, but it's support. We're in this together and we can fight it together. And I support this community that's being hardly oppressed, and we're gonna keep fighting together. So the city is with us, the county is with us. So the way I would encourage you to do it is talking to the supervisors, who some of them are here. Go ask them questions, go express your concerns, read the agenda and show up, okay? And then vote right.
You also bring up what I would say is a very constant strategy of ICE and DHS, right? And that's always upping the ante so that the public just wants them to ratchet it down to what was formerly the evil, violent norm, right? And I'll give one very concrete example. In Minneapolis, right, what's the name of the Border Patrol chief that they brought up to Minneapolis? Bavino, yes. So they brought Bavino up from the border region to be more militarized, throw his grenades, to be more violent. And then he Bavino'd so hard they got angry at him and took him away. But what did they do with him? They didn't fire him. Where'd they move him? They moved him right back to the border region, right? So what they did was say that we want a violent, militarized enforcement agent here. Oh, wait, you're on camera. Never mind, go back and do that in Latino communities. And now, spoiler alert, we don't want Bavino down there either, right? So what this is showing is that they're amping up the violence until it becomes visible and then removing that added element of violence to go back to a fairly violent norm, right? And it's actually part of the challenge in what I do when I talk about this work, because I'm focusing on often worksite raids, but I want to do so as a means of talking about the other 364 days that those raids don't happen. So I always think of that as like really a core tenet of what we do, right? It's not just reform the worst, but how can we dismantle a system that will perpetually peak at that level of violence?
So I wanted to get back to what you were talking about before, which is the notion of community and building community. I was up in Minneapolis this past weekend visiting friends and going to events and talking to people. And what I learned in a couple of days was the massive organization there, the huge groups that have come together on Signal and other places through portals. That one neighborhood near where Alex Prairie was murdered, 3 different groups of 3,000 formed within the space of a couple of weeks, offered different tasks through that same portal, whether they were going to go out and be the whistlers, whether they were going to be the people who were bringing food, standing at vigils, going and standing at schools or preschools to protect people, all through that same portal. Getting to know each other within neighborhoods, cross-cutting communities being built from groups that didn't necessarily get along that well before. And one of the other remarkable things about this community that's building there was after the second murder, one of the folks I talked to said he really wondered if there was simply going to be fear and if that was going to tamp everything down. Instead, what he experienced personally was all the restaurants in the area opening their doors to everybody who needed shelter right after that. And after about a half a day of people sitting back, they were back at it in full force. So his belief is that the community will continue to build and be active there and cross some of these gaps and chasms that have existed in the past, and that's how he believes they will defeat ICE.
We have time for one more question up front. Oh, okay, sure.
My question, it feels a little strange asking this given our current situation, but have we ever had movement toward meaningful immigration reform in the country? And not in terms of closing borders or limiting, but in terms of better pathways to citizenship or being more welcoming and accommodating?
My instinct is to cite the Bracero movement, but we know how that one ended. Yeah, I think, have we ever had an ideal system? No. Like we've talked about, right, the immigration system has always had these racial purification roots. But there are some things we've done that I think have There are some things we've done that I think have been beneficial, right? One is we've completely switched where we put our money to enforcement. This money could be spent on judges, right? For example, folks are applying for asylum. Folks are coming from, for example, Venezuela upon our invitation, and we could feasibly have enough money to have, or use the money to fund the judges to process asylum claims, right? We have processed more asylum claims in the past. We just see a switch from where we're putting our money, and now we're focusing on enforcement for sure. We've had more guest worker programs too. Often this is matching a need across countries, right? Folks want to work, and we have industries in which we want folks to work. It is possible to foreground this relationship as well, and it is just not where we spend our money, our attention, but also politicians have found that there is more to gain in terms of electability by being militarized and starting mass deportation campaigns than there is working across the aisle, right, and reforming the immigration system. So that's one of the primary changes that I think I've seen and documented under the Trump administration, is part of what kept previous immigration systems at least a little tamped down was that folks generally wanted to appeal to both sides of the aisle, to Democrat and Republican constituents, so that they could reform immigration in some way. We saw Bush do that. We saw Obama do that. Were there deportations under them? Certainly. The change we've seen with Trump is that there's no desire to speak to both sides of the aisle anymore. He's decided that by pushing further right, he can build a bigger constituency than if he were to try to reform immigration.
I don't have anything to add except that I know there's a lot of questions, and we're happy to talk afterwards with each of you.
Yeah.
Yes. I want to thank all of you so much for coming out tonight. I know that this is a topic and a conversation that we care deeply about in Iowa City. And as our speakers have said several times, it really does take all of us to work together to build the kind of community that we want to live in. So you being here really does matter. And I genuinely hope that you all take the opportunity to ripple out what you have learned here. And I would encourage you to, if you are interested in learning more, buy a copy of Bill's book and read that. And once you've finished reading it, to share it with somebody else so that they can read it. Bill will make his way out to the front there where there are copies of the book. So if you have more questions for him, please find him there, and he'll sign the copy of the book for you. Before we turn to that, I do hope that you will come to more of our programs. Like I said at the beginning, our next one is on the 19th of this month at Dream City, Beyond Divides in Iowa City's Black Community, Building Bridges Between Us. Another really incredibly important conversation about all of us, particularly focused on Black folks in our community, from born and raised in the US and those that have come from countries across the African continent in particular. So with that, folks, please help me in thanking our amazing speakers, Alejandra and